Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you who are joining us from the West Coast. Good evening to those of you who might be joining us where it is evening. I'm the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to this, our second webinar session. I see some familiar faces and names, so welcome back to those of you who have joined us before on the YDS campus, and welcome to all of you who are tuning into our community for the first time. We're really glad to have you. Thank you for joining us. We may be physically distant from one another, but the God we know, who is not limited by space or time, allows us to be connected to each other, sometimes in unique ways that we couldn't imagine. And thanks be to God for that. For our time today, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter and Dr. Seth Schoen will speak to us, and then there will be a time for questions after their presentation. You will remain muted for the duration of our time today, but we will be monitoring the chat window, so if you have a question, please feel free to type it in there. Our office has a delightful staff helping us today, and I'd like to introduce them very quickly, just so you can put some faces to the names of folks who are helping make our time go smoothly. And folks, when I say your names, just wave for a couple of seconds so everyone can know who you are in the Brady Bunch setup we have here of names and faces. So the Youth Ministry Institute falls under the umbrella of the Center of Continuing Education at YDS. We have Kelly Morrissey, who is the Managing Director of the Center for Continuing Ed. Megan Lukens is our Communications Coordinator, and Zachary Ludwig is our Seminary Summer Intern. Thank you to all of you for your hard work on this and on all of our events. So we have just a couple of quick announcements for the life of our community this morning, and then we'll get started. If you're new to the Youth Ministry Institute, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a free second, and that's yaleyouthministryinstitute.org. We have a whole array of resources on there. We have curricula for your youth, training modules for youth leaders, discussion forums, over 700 video clips and lectures given by leading youth ministry experts from around the world. We have COVID-19 era resources. We have some tips for working on dismantling racism with your youth. We have links to other articles and resources. It's a whole milieu of options there, and all of that is available for free. So please do check us out when you get a chance. We also would welcome you to mark your calendars for some upcoming events we have planned. Doctors Carter and Schoen will be co-teaching a 6-week course that is sort of a part 2 to this lecture, and that will begin next week on August 5th. I'll be sharing more about this at the end of our presentation, but classes for this will be held every other Wednesday from 12 to 1:30 from August 5th to October 14th. And space will be limited, so please do sign up if you are available and interested, especially after today, if you're hoping to dig a little deeper into this work of anti-racism through a lens of compassion, both for your personal ministry and for yourself. Please do consider joining us for that. And there'll be a link to register in our chat window after the presentation today. And finally, a little bit about our 2020 to 2021 lecture series. Our theme for this year will be Not Your Mother's Youth Group, Ministry to Youth in This Time. And in addition to this great work of anti-racism, we'll be talking about things like how youth experience Sabbath rest, building resilience in our young people, addressing long-term trauma, and how to build up student leadership through things like mission work and outdoors ministry, even in the midst of a pandemic. We'll kick off that series on Wednesday, September 9th, when we will welcome Dr. Nathan Stuckey from Princeton Seminary. He has written a book, Wrestling with Rest, that deals with Sabbath rest and how youth experience that. Nate is a Quaker by background, and he'll be encouraging us to be reflective and thoughtful, even as we look to ramp up for the school year, about what that pacing really could look like as we consider the needs for our young people right now. So please do consider joining us then on Wednesday, September 9th. And now it is my deep pleasure to introduce all of you to Doctors Carter and Schoen. The Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter's teaching, research, and activist interests are in Black, womanist, and environmental ethics. He has a particular focus on race, food, and non-human animals. He is the co-creator of Racial Resilience, which is an anti-racism and anti-bias program. It utilizes the combined insights of contemplative practices and critical race theories. His academic publications include The Spirit of Soul Food and Blood in the Soil, the Racial, Racist, and Religious Dimensions of Environmentalism. The passion that informs all of his works evolves out of his family's struggle to loosen the chains of systemic racism. And you'll be hearing more about that very shortly. Dr. Seth Schoen's research and teaching interests are in contemplative and spiritual practices, especially in the cultivation of compassion. He is currently exploring how the compassion practice and critical and race and racial formation theories mutually inform each other to create a spiritual path of renewal and transformation. As part of this effort, he has co-created, along with the Reverend Dr. Carter, Racial Resilience, an anti-racism and anti-bias training program. It seeks to facilitate these conversations about race by grounding them in compassion and in open, non-judgmental, non-reactive dialogue, creating personal and interpersonal spaces. Currently, Dr. Schoen is also an adjunct professor of practical theology at the University of San Diego. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. We are beyond honored to have you, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Jill, thank you so much for having us. I should say everyone that's involved with the Yale Youth Ministry Institute. We're very grateful to be back, as this is our second time back, and appreciate the opportunity, and also recognize the enormity of the task and the enormity of the moment that we find ourselves in, given everything happening with the pandemic, given everything happening right now with the movement for Black Lives, and how this intersects with so many other social movements. And in that spirit, we wanted to begin today by observing a moment of silence for a pioneer in this movement in the United States. For those of you who may not be aware, today they are memorializing John Lewis. I would highly encourage you actually to read a brief opinion piece he wrote that was published this morning in the New York Times. He wrote it just a few weeks ago before he passed away. And it really speaks to his vision and hope for this current generation to continue what he felt like he and others were continuing on in his own life and ministry. And so I'd invite you to just find your center, to ground yourself, to breathe deeply, and observe this moment in reflection and gratitude for a life well lived. And invite you to find yourself again, to come back to this present moment. And as we get ready to move into our talk this morning, I'm reminded of something that John would always say. His documentary actually is titled, it had the same title that's done on, it's on Amazon right now. He called Getting in Good Trouble. And the importance of getting in good trouble. And I'd like to hope that after today, we are equipping you with some tools to help you actually perhaps even instigate a little bit of good trouble in your present congregations. So I'm going to share our screen right now so we can share our Prezi. And then I should be on there. Perfect. And we can get going, and I will invite Dr. Schoen to, well, I guess before I do that, I should say a little bit about who we are. Essentially, Dr. Schoen and I, as we're just introduced, we feel as though we are called to do this work out of our own faith tradition, our own Christian commitment to foster relationships across racial difference, across difference in general. So much of our thinking, and theorizing around racial resilience emerges from our own friendship and our long friendship and the kind of vulnerability and honesty that we have with each other. And one of the things that Seth has shared with me when we talk about what it means to be friends in a kind of ways that can really begin to dismantle some of the structures that come up in between us. He said to me the other day, like, the kind of friendship we are speaking of is the kind of friend that you would cry with, right? Do you have the kind of friend that you would cry with? And that's the kind of relationships that we are talking about helping to create, that we believe are fundamental to doing this work in a sustainable, long-term kind of way. These are, I'll let Seth take it away and maybe say a little bit more about him before we move on.
Hello, so I'm Dr. Seth Schoen, and you've got the technical information from me. So I'll give a little more of the humanizing information. So in the bottom left, you have a picture of my father with my daughter, Belle, and they're playing cards. And so 4-point pitch is the card game that my family plays, my extended family plays. And so it's a rite of passage. It's kind of a cultural rite of passage. And so to see her kind of looking at the cards is really heartwarming for me, and I think really captures an important aspect of my family. Then you see Belle in the top picture at this past Christmas. She's being held by her uncle Omar, and she just looks really cute there. So that's why I threw that picture in. And then on the bottom is, I think this past Thanksgiving, is Belle, my wife, and I. And my wife is a huge source of support in my journey, both financially. She supported me through graduate school, but also emotionally. She is what keeps me going in tough times. Between her and Chris, that's pretty much how I'm supported. Those are the pillars that keep me going in my life. And so we also wanted to begin with me sharing a little bit about how I became interested in race and issues of race and racism and practicing anti-racism. It's, I'm a white male. There's not enough of us doing this kind of work. And so for me, it sort of begins in my early 20s when I was in AmeriCorps. So I had dropped out of college, not knowing what to do with my life. And I wanted to do some community service. And so I joined AmeriCorps National Civilian Community Corps. And one of our project rounds was in East Baltimore at an inner city elementary school. And so our responsibilities at that school were to just help out in whatever way they needed. And I was assigned a second grade classroom. And so my primary responsibility there was tutoring one of the students who was behind in reading. And that's where I learned that I liked teaching. I really enjoyed working with him one-on-one. But also, kids at that age just love you. And so it was easy to be around these children and to develop relationships with them, and they just very quickly trust you. And so one day, we're all in line to go to recess, and one of the kids looks up at me and says, "Mr. Schoen, are you white?" And before I had a chance to answer, another kid jumped in and said, No, he ain't white. He's light-skinned." And so I laughed. I didn't know what to say. It was a weird experience. I'd never been black before in my life. I've never been black again in my life. So for this brief moment, there was this weird situation, and I didn't know how to handle it. But reflecting on it, I realized that the kid that jumped in to defend me, already at this age, knew some very, very fundamental truths about the way race functions in the United States. And so for him, he liked me, he trusted me. And in his world, that meant that I couldn't be white, because there was something about being white that meant that wasn't quite okay. And so I was included, and so I had to be light-skinned to fit within his community. And the other experience was that we got to school one morning, and the principal met us and said, "We need you to go around and guard all the doors. We need you to make sure that none of the children leave. We don't know where it's happened, but there's been a murder and the body's on the playground." And as it happens, I was assigned the door that opened to the playground. And the body was on the kickball field outside, just outside the door. And I had wondered how many kids crossed the kickball field on the way to school this morning and saw this murdered woman. And that's brought home that this is a very different environment. I mean, there was nothing in my upbringing in Nebraska that prepared me to deal with this kind of reality. This really opened my eyes to the reality of race and racism in the United States. But I didn't know what to do with that. This was this calling unfulfilled is what happened. We went on with our other project rounds, and these experiences kind of sat, and I didn't know what to do with them. And then I went to graduate school where I met Chris, and we became fast friends. And early on in our relationship, we talked about race. Chris was more than willing to talk about it. And I was doing some things that we later learned through our friendship that I didn't necessarily realize I was doing. I was just listening to his experiences and trying to understand them because I felt the sense of importance with them, that my life was changed because of what he was sharing with me. And there was this, once again, this reality being shown to me that's outside of my everyday experience. And that calling started to emerge again. I didn't know it yet, but it started to emerge. And then, one day Chris and I are talking again, talking about race, and he stops in the middle of the sentence and looks at me and says, "Seth, you talk about race and you think about race more than any other white person I know, and more than most people of color I know." And so for me, this was a moment of awakening, really, where I realized that, wow, I really am interested in this. I do a lot with it, but outside of my graduate studies, just for my own personal interest. And so I shifted my graduate studies to focus on race and racism as an area of expertise. And that process led to the program and presentation that we're providing today. So that's part of my journey.
Yeah, that's the, I would say definitely the Cliff's Notes version, but I think that's kind of all we have to give right now in terms of time. But yeah, what always interested me and drew me to Seth in these conversations, as he began to allude to, was that it's more so that Seth, he was curious, but Seth listened. And we're gonna talk a little bit about that later. Like Seth genuinely believed in the things I was telling him because we come from very different backgrounds. And so on this bottom picture, you see a picture of my son, Isaiah, my grandfather, whom we were fortunate to see right at the end of February, beginning of March, right before the pandemic. My grandfather still lives in Michigan. I live in San Diego, obviously. And so we're really grateful that we had a chance because we're honestly unsure when the next time we're gonna be able to see him. And so my grandfather was a migrant farmer, migrant picker in Jim Crow, Mississippi. And so he grew up extremely poor, and my mother grew up kind of poor, and I grew up just a little bit above kind of poor. And I think that part of the reason why I have committed myself to this work is in a lot of ways not so much respect, but I think in a large way honoring the work of my maternal grandparents and what they did and how they were able to lift our family out of generational poverty for me to be the first person in my family to go to undergrad, let alone graduate school. You see a broader picture there of my family, my mom and my stepdad and my brothers. That's at the day one of my brothers got married, and a picture of my wife and I on a trip in England. We're at Hadrian's Wall. My wife's family is from England, and so we were able to go visit the villages of her ancestors, which was pretty cool. My journey to this work is much different than Dr. Schoen's in the sense that I've always been interested in race. It wasn't really, to me, a question of race, but it's this role of compassion that we're going to discuss in a few moments, right? I didn't know anything about contemplative practices using that kind of language, right? I grew up going to a Black church, and in a Black church tradition, we don't use words, at least in my tradition, we don't use words like contemplation. What we did use words was like prayer. My grandmother would always talk about going to the prayer closet, putting on a prayer shawl. We would have services of lament. And what I've come to learn is that the same kind of language, the same kind of things we were doing are very much contemplative, but often not referred to as contemplative within this kind of Western tradition that defines what these things are in these kinds of silos, right? And so there is a deep and rich contemplative tradition within the African-American Christian community. However, I was not really attuned to it in those ways. I took a class my senior year or my last year, my master's degree called Spiritual Formation for the Contemplative Way with Frank Rogers, whom we're going to talk about a little bit later. And I really learned the importance of centering down, as Howard Thurman would call, and finding myself and being able to kind of begin to heal some of the traumas of my own life and my own childhood. But I didn't really do much with those practices at all. I started a PhD program and was doing really well. One thing I will tell you that a PhD program, for those of you who have not gone to one or graduate school or anything like that, but it does teach you how to do and teaches you how to think, and it teaches you how to argue. And that is not exact. The second part is not exactly helpful for most marriages. I will say that it's not exactly helpful for most marriages. And so I learned how to deconstruct all of the things that my wife was telling me when we would have our arguments. And that slowly began to deteriorate our marriage. And so much so that we had to be separated for several months while I was finishing my PhD. It was during that moment that I returned back to the compassion practice, that I returned back to contemplative prayer, because I knew this wasn't an issue of love. It really was an issue of healing. I needed to heal things going on with me, and as did my wife. And Seth was there with me with this whole journey. And I would honestly say I know I would not be married if it was not for Seth and Frank and other people we're going to talk about today. And so in the midst of coming to these practices and learning how to understand what's going on in me and grounding myself in every conversations with my wife, these skills kind of just stayed with me. And I realized that I was using the same skills that I used to navigate the relationship and eventual reconciliation with my wife, dealing with issues of racial microaggressions. I was using the same exact things, just in different ways, just kind of intuitively. I explained this to Seth, and we realized it was kind of a big deal. And that is really the beginning of how we started this in 2013. And we've been working on this process ever since. But for us, more than anything, we see the compassion practice as a way to begin to heal, to really allow us to heal the racial traumas that are very different from us, that are very different across racial spectrums, I guess I should say. And we'd like to think of this metaphor, we'd like to think of the metaphor of healing rather than like the metaphor for bridge, right? You often hear that we're trying to bridge racial difference. We're trying to say, oh, we're trying to be bridge builders. The problem with that metaphor, we believe, is it creates this false idea that these groups are somehow actually separate, right? When in the Christian tradition, we all believe that we all create an image of God, that we all are part of the body of Christ even, right? And so when you have the metaphor of a bridge, what it's basically saying is we have to find some false construction, something that's not, something to keep us together. And what we like to suggest is it's not so much a bridge that we need, is there's an open wound that has been allowed to fester in Christianity, in American Christianity specifically, that hasn't been allowed to heal. And so what the compassion practice does is it gives us the tools to tend to that wound, to heal it, to allow it to actually scab over. The scar is always going to be there. The scar is a part of the legacy of racism, particularly within the Christian tradition, but we can heal. That is something that we can do if we go through the proper kinds of treatment. So with that, let me we're going to tell you a little bit about kind of what is compassion and why we decided to use it with anti-racism.
So compassion in its most basic form is being moved in our depths by the experiences of another, such that we respond in ways that intend to ease the suffering or promote the flourishing of another. And that's the most simple definition of compassion that we can offer from the way that we study and practice it. And so compassion is important because it's the core skill that grounds our approach to anti-racism. That compassion is how we connect to the truth of who we are. It's how we see others as fully human. And compassion is the path by which we understand what it means to be created in the image of God. So for us, compassion forms the foundational lens of how we view and interpret the way that racialization impacts our worldview and our bodies. And that lens orients us to the way we study race. And so normally, we're caught up in the busyness of life. We're surrounded by turmoil. Right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're at home far more often than we want to be. The people that we love most, that we're at home with, seem less like people that we love most and more like people that are making our worlds difficult. And so if there's a compassionate core within us, we just do not feel connected to it. And we need a way to connect to our compassionate core. And this way is a threefold path of compassion that we understand as Jesus's radical path of compassion. And there's three dimensions to it. So the first is a deepening of our connection to the compassion of God, a restoration to a humanity fully loved and alive, and then an increase to our capacity to be instruments of compassion toward others in the world. And so it's this rhythm of compassion for taking time for ourselves, grounding ourselves in God, and then moving out with compassion into the world, becoming depleted and returning to ourselves to restore us, grounding in God again. And this rhythm, this pulse of compassion, is what restores us to our authentic selves and gives us, empowers us to engage in the world through compassion. And so Jesus embodied this compassionate way of being in the world in the midst of intense marginalization and oppression. And so we have a picture of Jesus and the Disinherited and Howard Thurman up here because Howard Thurman doesn't use the word compassion, but this is what he talks about in this landmark book, is what Jesus has to offer to who he calls the disinherited and who we would call today the marginalized and the oppressed. And in our best moments, we see ourselves as carrying on the tradition of Howard Thurman.
And so for us, that's really critical, I think, in terms of how we think about why compassion intersects with anti-racism. So fundamentally, we believe that traditional anti-racism, anti-bias programs, they depersonalize racism or bias to just focus on structure. Now, this is a part of a consequence of the idea of what racism is to being super personalized and only being limited to maybe race to words or actions of one particular individual and not looking at structure. And so you have this large swing to just looking at structure and say, okay, well, it's only in this kind of depersonalized notion of structure. And while we are going to definitely talk about the role and import of structural racism, what we believe is that we actually, as human beings, we make up the structures, right? We are a part of those structures. And so this is a flaw because we make up the structures we are trying to change. And so our definition of structural racism takes seriously the role in which humans are active agents within these structures, right? That we believe is critically important. Secondly, we believe anti-racism work causes us to be reactive. It's really difficult. It's really draining, and it brings up all kinds of emotions. And so we have to have the tools to mine the wisdom of these reactivities. And we do believe that those reactive emotions have kernels of wisdom within them. Again, as Seth mentioned, compassion is at the core of Jesus's ministry of anti-oppression. This is a part of, we believe, what Jesus calls us to do and who we are called to be and become in the ways in which he reflects the Imago Dei. And lastly, as Christians, as people of faith, we believe that we have a vocational responsibility to love God and love neighbor as we love ourselves. And the gravity of this greatest commandment of loving God and loving neighbor and loving ourselves often gets overlooked, because when you actually read it in its entirety, what you see is that our capacity to love others, our capacity to love our neighbor, is deeply tied to our capacity to love ourselves, right? The ability we have to love not only the parts of ourselves that we like, but the parts of ourselves that we know need to improve, the parts of ourselves we don't like, our own insecurities, right? So as you will see as we move forward, we believe fundamental to the aspect of anti-racism involves a kind of self-compassion that moves outward towards the other in order to see them in their full humanness as God has called them to be. And this indeed is a risk, right? It is a risk in this country today to see others as full human beings, right? To see them beyond the binaries we've created around sexuality or around race or around ability, but to see them as the beautiful person that they are. This takes a kind of courage at times to stand up against the systems and institutions that would deem otherwise. And so this for us is the courage that we believe we are going to try to help you give some tools today to be able to foster in your own particular communities. So before we move on too much to get into the theoretical aspects of the compassion practice, we want to spend a little bit of time doing a little bit of education to make sure we're kind of on the same page, to help you get a little bit of understanding of how we understand race to function and how it works, right? So we use the theoretical framework of Oh Man, Why Not in their landmark text, Racial Formation in the United States, the 3rd edition. And I think it's important for us to kind of make sure we're all saying the same things when we're talking about race and racism, because more often than not, we believe that when you ask people, then when they say something is racist, something isn't racist, if you ask them to define what racism is, you see that perhaps people haven't given that as much time and reflection as they otherwise should. So we believe that race is a master category in the United States, right? A fundamental concept that has profoundly shaped and continues to shape the history, the polity, economy, and culture of the United States. And so in this sense, because race is a master category, racism has been conceptually deflated to only be like, again, racist acts or racist words, like in the way people might use language that clearly we would deem as racist in terms of who they are in hurling racial epithets. Or it can be deflated to where people say things like they don't see race, right, because of the era of colorblindness, to where people would argue that the best way to move past racism is to basically say that we're all just the human beings. And this kind of conceptual inflation and deflation is a part of we believe, a problem, because while racism is indeed created, it doesn't exist biologically, it is. And we have to recognize the fact that it exists in as much as we've created it, and is not going to go away. And it's not about moving past race as much as it is about learning how to navigate our current terrain in a way that is anti-racist because of the structure of racism. We believe a helpful concept to thinking about the impact of racism is this notion of a racial project. Now, a racial project is an effort to organize and distribute resources or goods along particular racial lines. And so if you think about, for instance, voting and the significance of the Voting Rights Act in terms of distributing the good of voting to everybody at the time it was passed, and then the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, right, that we saw take place in, I think, 2013 or 2012, what we see there is the fact that the people who are disproportionately impacted by the gutting of the Voting Rights Act were people of color, and people that are living in rural areas, who are predominantly people of color. And so in this sense, the way we can talk about this action, even though there's no verbal, no written document that says we are doing this policy to disproportionately harm Black people, the impact, the outcome marginalizes and harms Black people. And so in this way, a racial project can be defined as racist if it reproduces structures based on racial domination or racial significations, right? So because this is a distinction between intention and harm, intention and outcome, I should say. And so even though one could say your intentions may be good, or maybe their intentions, and that's even questionable, but we can say in best case scenario, their intentions are good, the outcome is that it harms and disproportionately harms Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so therefore, we can say this action is racist because the outcome is racist, regardless of the intentions. And this distinction between intention versus outcome is critical if we are going to move towards cultivating an anti-racist conscience, right? We have to look past the words that are written down on laws or bills or even policies by looking at and also examine what are the outcomes of these particular situations, right? And so in this sense, understanding and identifying racism requires an analysis of the outcomes and not merely an analysis of the intentions. We believe that with that lens in mind, recognizing that racism is about balancing outcomes, we got to think about, okay, how do we begin to measure outcomes, right? So we know the departure point for the class we're going to start next week is going to be the fact that racism is systemic and it's about economy, polity, and ideology. And for us, we argue that structural racism includes these 3 points, right? The institutionalized economic and other social resource inequalities that can be traced along racial lines. So there you're talking about property rights. You are talking about economic capacities in terms of who can own businesses and who can't, taxes, banking, all these other things that can be traced along racial lines, right? In terms of who has access to some goods and who doesn't. Two, the institutionalized political marginalization that can be traced along racial lines. So we just talked about the importance of voting rights. And lastly, institutionalized ideological control, with ideology being a set of shared beliefs that help normalize and ultimately moralize racism. And this, I think, is essentially essential and critical when we are having these kinds of conversations, and something that we're going to speak in more detail in a moment. Now, as we are moving towards this conversation and beginning to move deeper into race, we recognize fundamentally that race brings up a lot of stuff, right? And a lot of people, right? That race talk, race thinking, race conversations can be challenging. So I'm actually gonna stop sharing really quick and zoom out so you guys can, for those of you, make sure you can kind of see my face. The question that we'd like you to ask, or that we're asking you all, first we'd like to invite you to go to Mentimeter. So you saw on the slide where it says go to www.menti.com, menti.com. And we're going to create an interactive word cloud. This word cloud is basically going to hopefully illustrate some of the stuff that we believe kind of help us give I guess, name some of the stuff that comes up for us when we're having these kinds of conversations and we're beginning to think about it. And so the question we'd like to ask you to answer is this: what feelings, thoughts, or emotions come up for you when you know you are going to talk about race or privilege? So when you get to Menti, you enter code 450517. That's 450517. And the question should pop up right on the screen. And you can type in, I think, up to 3 words that describes how you feel when you answer that question. And I'm gonna share the word cloud so we can kind of see how that is populating in and of itself. And then we'll kind of debrief kind of what came up, and Seth will say a little bit more about the importance of this practice and why we decided to do it this way.
So as you finish entering, return to the word cloud, and you can watch it generate as people continue to enter the emotions that are present for them. And as you're watching the word cloud, just pay attention to the emotions that come up. Which ones resonate with you? Maybe the ones you entered, certainly, but maybe there are others that resonate with you as well. And so as the word cloud continues to generate, I think most of us are probably familiar with word clouds, but just in case some of us aren't, the larger the word is, the more times it's been entered. And so the more prominent that emotion is amongst our group. And so what we want to say about these emotions is that these emotions are all present now. We're talking about race. This is a presentation about race. And even in this virtual space, these emotions are present. And so usually we're asked to leave these emotions at the door. We see them as what causes us to stop learning about race or prevents us from learning things that we need to know. And so we're either tacitly or explicitly asked to not bring our emotions into spaces where we're learning about race. And we flip that on its head, obviously, because here we're doing a practice bringing them into this space. And we flip this on its head because we understand that all of these emotions at their core are trying to do something to help us. There's a wisdom that they possess that needs to be heard, that's trying to help us flourish in some way. And when we take the time to get grounded, to come back to ourselves, to understand the wisdom within these emotions, instead of anxiety, that seems to be the most present, so I'll just work with that one. Instead of anxiety being what prevents us from learning about race and racism, anxiety can become one of the emotions that helps sustain and motivate us to continue learning about anti-racism when we understand what it's trying to bring to our lives. So the question is then, how do we do this? How do we tend to these emotions? And an important aspect of emotions is the role of ideology. And so I'll hand it back over to Chris here to continue. Thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thank you all for participating. I know, I'm sorry, I kind of clumsily did not introduce that as well. That was supposed to be Seth, so you can tell that's probably why it was a little bit awkward in the transition. So I apologize, I misread my notes. But you all figured it out because you're all smart people, so I deeply appreciate your grace and kindness. But as Seth said, ideology, we believe, is fundamentally important for our approach. I would say for people of faith or people who are not of faith, just the ways in which we need to recognize how our persons are embedded within these structures. Ideology plays a crucial role in enabling structured racist systems to persist by explaining away racist systems through common sense beliefs, right? And so these kinds of common sense beliefs, we kind of are all familiar with them because they're things that we've heard before. Again, they're kind of within the realm of common sense. So things like inner city schools are not good because students have behavior problems, or that Black people don't have as much wealth because they are not good with their money, or white people have earned their wealth through hard work and merit, or the fact or this notion that there are more Black people in jail because they are more prone to violence, and any of these other beliefs. These ideologies are normalized and then become moralized. The belief that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color were less than human and thus fit for slavery or fit for genocide, even if they did convert to Christianity. And so this is why we think it's important for people who, especially people of faith, but particularly people who operate and live within this kind of American structural system, to take seriously the role and import of ideology and how it's a part of normalizing and maintaining the systems of racism. The biggest way we can begin to, or I want to say that one of the best ways we begin to think about the importance of ideology and how it's pervasive within orienting our notion of what it means to be race in this country is for us to go back and think about colonialism and how this all got started, and the way in which we began to theologically, ethically, economically begin to exploit BIPOC people. And when I say BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So colonialism in its broadest sense refers to the specific form of cultural exploitation that developed with the expansive Europe over the past 500 years by the implanting of settlements on distant territories. Our modern notions of what it means to be a human, what we say when we're talking about the term animal, or even our modern concept of race begins to emerge during this period, because you have settler colonies emphasizing the idea of cultural inferiority of the colonized. And so this sets up the binary of the colonized and the colonizer, right? This is best exemplified in this brief little 1.5-minute clip that I'm going to show you right now, this documentary about Christianity's impact on Indigenous cultures.
religion has been our biggest problem. It was the Pope who made that statement in 1493, if there are no Christian nations in this new land that you have discovered, I declare those lands to be empty, open for colonization by Christian nations. Christian nations, very explicit. Further, if there are people there and they are not Christians, they do not have a right of title to land. Disenfranchised the whole Western Hemisphere with one statement. We had no idea he said that. We had no idea. And it prevails today. Cheryl versus Oneida Indian Nation, 2005, first notation, Doctrine of Discovery. First notation. That's 1493. Doctrine of Discovery. It's still calling us non-Christians, non-title. So, what has to change, obviously, is that kind of understanding. You know, if there are no Christian nations. So Christianity has been a problem.
And so what we see briefly in that video is the development of the beginnings, I say, the seeds being planted of the development of this theological anthropology, where you hear about this doctrine of discovery in 1493 still being used, right, in the Supreme Court in 2005. The person who wrote that opinion, just for your own edification, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so this is when the court, we would suggest at this time, is supposed to be more liberal. And they're still using the language of the doctrine of discovery in discussions and determinations on who have rights to particular indigenous territories. And so I think it's important for us to understand that the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of this kind of dehumanization spans Americans. It's not limited to conservatives or liberals. It's a part of our particular notion of an American consciousness that we have to continue to mine and continue to decolonize as we move forward, regardless of our how liberal or progressive we think we are, because these things have a way of reasserting themselves. And so in this sense, when we're talking about how we've come to understand what it means to be human, we argue that there's no coincidence that colonialism and slavery emerged during the period when European Christian men were able to claim that African indigenous American people were evil and savage because they were either non-Christian or too close to nature and like animals and therefore distant from God. And so there's this way in which people begin again to normalize and then moralize the genocide and enslavement of these particular groups of people. Once it becomes accepted, it can become morally right. And Thurman says this in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Dwight Hopkins, a professor and theologian at the University of Chicago, argues that this kind of thinking, this kind of dehumanizing way of understanding people who are non-European and people, quite honestly, who are non-white male European, he describes it as demonic individualism, really in three parts. He says it takes place of historical amnesia, meaning a deep and abiding ignorance of the actual history of this country and the history of how things came to be. One of the things I'm going to encourage you guys, we're going to talk about at the very end, is resources. One resource is the 1619 project that really talks about the development of chattel slavery. And that, I think, is one way he began to dismantle some of that historical amnesia. But we see it happening today with the fight over Confederate monuments and what these kinds of, what they mean and why they're there, right? This kind of amnesia or rewriting of our history. Instantaneous fulfillment of desires, this notion or belief that we should be able to do what we want to do when we want to do it all the time. And we see that getting played out right now, quite honestly, in the way in which some people are responding to our public health crisis. And this notion of the weird number one mythology, American exceptionalism, this belief that because we are America, that whatever we developed or came up with is clearly the best and the right thing that the rest of the world ought to abide by and do. with this kind of seeds, right, within our theological anthropology, it develops a kind of what I call implicit theological anthropology underneath that. This idea that essentially we are taught and socialized to accept a normative structure of Christianity that places humans at the pinnacle of creation, right? So human beings are at the top, quite, if you will, this kind of hierarchy of being. Racial formation ensures that human is understood to be white. Patriarchy ensures that he is male. And heterosexism ensures that he is straight. So in this sense, when Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, women, and non-cisgender folk strive to be full human beings within this flawed structure, we are striving toward an anti-Christian theological principle that replicates an oppressive hierarchical model that places whiteness, maleness, and heterosexism as a pinnacle of creation. And so in this sense, the only way that I, as a Black man, can be a full human being is if I identify and align with these kinds of ideas and ideologies that ultimately dehumanize me, right? I have to align with the ideology that places white, straight males at this pinnacle, again, of creation, this hierarchy of being. And so in this sense, oppressed and marginalized people are given some of the privileges of humanness as long as we don't challenge existing hierarchical structure. So we cannot be seen as full human beings, but we can be seen as somewhat acceptable beings in this kind of structure. And so the way we move forward through this is and how this gets lived out every day, kind of on a daily basis, right? In the ways in which people don't talk about theological anthropology or all these kinds of things, but it gets lived out in our day-to-day experience, we believe through something called the white racial frame. It's a book by the author named Joe Fegan. This is a comprehensive orienting structure that's created to help us understand and interpret and act in social settings. It contributes often to white denial about the reality of race and racism because it shields white people from having to develop the resilience to actually confront the way race has shaped and continues to shape their lives. And so in this sense, because of that, we believe that we can resist and dismantle the white racial frame when we center the experience and voices of those who are marginalized. And so I think in some sense, this is why clergy struggle to explain with depth and detail the theological problems of racism, because they don't have to, because they don't have the, really, I would say, the appropriate kind of training. And so when we think about, perhaps those of you who've been to seminary or been to that kind of education, think about how many of the, how much we had to learn about the controversies in Orthodox Christian history, right? How much we had to learn about different kinds of heretical controversies of Docetism, those other kinds of things, relative to how much time we spent discussing on the Christian acceptance of slavery and racism, right? And so just think about that. How much do we actually talk about that in our systematic theology class, right? Not just our class on religion and race, but our class that actually is supposed to help us understand how to think or how we might organize our understandings of what it means to be a person of faith. And so in this sense, this is part of the challenge that we are trying to bring to light within communities of faith, is recognizing that this frame severely has handicapped the development, the theological development of so many clergy or so many people that are involved in religious settings, because this is something that's just not often taught. So what is the right racial frame, right? What is it? Specifically, it's a worldview held by many people, but especially white people. It's an overarching view that encompasses broad and persisting set of racial stereotypes, prejudice, ideologies, images, interpretations, narratives, emotions, and reactions to language accents, as well as inclinations to discriminate. In this sense, it contributes to both the ideological aspects of structural racism. And so if we think about, again, how this gets played out within structural racism, there's an excellent book that, again, is on this list of recommendations we're going to share at the end of our talk today, by Jeanine Hill Fletcher, called The Sin of White Supremacy, Christianity, Racism, and Religious Diversity in America. In the beginning of that text, she writes that in 1878, U.S. Senator A.A. Sargent proposed to ban Chinese immigrants after they had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Because the U.S. was accepting waves of European immigrants, his argument was that his argument against the Chinese was that their customs and their way of life could not be assimilated into a white Christian nation. He said that America should send Christian missionaries to China to, quote, wash their robes and make them white in the blood of the Lamb, end quote. And then they would be able to apply, then they would be fit enough to apply for citizenship, right? And so this is how ideology impacts structure, how it's a part of the structure. How ideology reinforces the political nature of the structure and the economic nature of the structure, right? And so this is what we believe is the importance of really wrestling with how our worldview is shaped through the logic of whiteness. And it is pervasive, right? In its 2001 survey by the Washington Post, it found that 61% of people on average believed that Black people had the same access to healthcare. 51% believed that we had the same access or similar or better education. And 50% believed that whites and Blacks are about as well off in their jobs. And so when combined, whites held at least 70% of whites held at least one false belief about these important Black-white differentials. And so this is critical, right? This is deeply important because it allows these kinds of assumptions about power and privilege to go unchecked because people are unwilling or unable to actually find and navigate appropriate sources when they're trying to find information on these things. And so with regards to the impact on the white racial frame and how it kind of impacts the everyday structures, a couple of things I want to lift up before we move into talking about our particular notion of racial resilience. One is language evasion, right? And by this, we mean the way in which we even talk about racism. Often it's in the passive tense. And so we'll say things like, you know, maybe 45% of Black people say they have experienced discrimination when applying for a mortgage, rather than talking about the ways in which the mortgage industry or the banking industry itself, run predominantly by white people, continues to historically marginalize Black people, right? And so instead of using the active tense, we use a passive tense. You know, we say things like maybe 70% of African Americans are discriminated against. Instead of saying like white people discriminate like against Black people 70% of the time, right? So the ways in which we frame these things are often really important in terms of how we can hold ourselves accountable to the reality of what we are experiencing. I think it's also one way it pops up is how some folks get really uncomfortable when you say things like white people, and they say, well, it's not all white people. And that is one of the ways in which that's able to kind of divert or change the subject and take the decenter, I would say, the experience of people of color and recenter it on the ways in which perhaps some white people may feel as though they're being victimized because of being lumped in with the group. And the challenge with this is that if someone is talking about or in generalizing the ways in which the majority of a certain group of people are, then if that does not include you, there has to be a way in which you are able to decenter yourself and not see yourself as a part of this larger group if you know you are doing what you are supposed to be doing, while also recognizing that historically this has been the case, that it has been most white people who have done A, B, C, or D. And lastly, and the importance of collective memory and collective forgetting. We talked about historical amnesia in terms of the ways in which it kind of adds to collective forgetting, to suppress or weaken collective memories of societal impression. But collective memory is also pretty important because what that does, it recasts the past in ways that give that lift up and memorialize or glorify certain things in ways in which that are inconsistent with reality. And we see this happen in the ways in which, if you were to ask, like statistically, you ask like older white people how things were the 50s and 60s, and most often the language they use, what they talk about, is not nearly as, they don't talk about things as bad, for instance, as Black people, because their experience is rooted in themselves without this awareness of how other people were being treated or and how that impacted their day-to-day lives. Fegan talks about this so much in his book, and it's a really important point Because unless we begin to understand the experiences of those people who are beyond ourselves and have compassion towards them, we are going to have a very difficult time actually moving towards developing an anti-racist conscience. And so now we're going to share just a little bit about why we created Racial Resilience and kind of what we are hope to be doing over the next several weeks as we go over this course and then open it up for questions. So Seth, do you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about point number one?
Absolutely. So there were three principal reasons that we created Racial Resilience that motivated us to create this process. And so the first was the emotional hurdles of whiteness. So that is all the stuff that comes up for us as white people when we learn about race. And this really starts with my own experience. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I was developed in graduate school, I developed another area of expertise in race and racism. And so as I was learning about these different race theories, I kept running into all of these emotional hurdles and all of these barriers to developing this area of expertise. And so Chris was there kind of shepherding me through this, and I was able to talk with him, and that helped. But they kept coming back. And so out of sheer frustration, I started looking at anti-racism programs to try and find some way to deal with all this stuff. And what was really frustrating about looking at these different programs is I didn't find a single one in all that I looked at that gave me tools for how to deal with my emotions. When they mentioned emotions at all, the advice was that your emotions are your responsibility to deal with and don't bring them into the learning space. And so that was very frustrating for me because I agree that my emotions are my responsibility, but I need some tools to deal with this. And so as I kept researching, I learned, well, okay, this is not a problem that I alone am having. Like, this is the problem for most white people. We all have this difficulty. And so I thought, okay, so if this is a problem for most white people, then this is a problem that needs to be addressed. It needs a better solution to deal with it yourself. So we set out to find some way to deal with this. And compassion is what we came up with. Compassion is the way that we address the stuff that comes up within us. And if we don't take the time to deal with this stuff, we as white people don't stand a chance of making it out of the anti-racist starting blocks. Compassion is the best way that we know how.
And I think for people of color, while we don't have the same kind of emotional anxieties or racial anxieties that white people have with regards to racism, there is still a particular kind of burden or exhaustion that those of us face. And this isn't to say that all BIPOC people are trying to do anti-racist work or that they should, but this is recognition that we're often going to be asked about it, even if that is something that we don't want. And so in some ways, that, particularly in our current moment, it leads to a kind of exhaustion, right? A kind of emotional exhaustion, emotional fatigue. And there's a brilliant scholar by the name of Elaine Geronimus, who's at the University of Michigan, who's developed and pioneered this concept called weathering. And what that is, it talks about the ways in which racial microaggressions continue to, how they harm Black, Indigenous, and other people of color from the inside out. There's an amazing article on NPR and called "This Racism." I think it's called "This Racism is Killing Me from the Inside," and it talks about how essentially because of the microaggressions you have to face every day, that your body stays in a higher elevated level of stress. Basically, that's what you maintain, and so your body's in a constant fight mode. And because of that, it eats away essentially at itself. And so things that scientists and doctors originally thought were contributing to early mortality rates of BIPOC people, were like health and well-being or diet, they're now able to determine and see that the living within the pervasive reality of a racist structure literally is harming us. It's emotionally harming us, it's physically harming us. And so because of that, what racial resilience does it gives us a way to tend to that stuff. This notion of self-compassion is deeply powerful and effective for doing that kind of healing, so that we can either do this work that we feel called to do, the anti-racism training work, or so that we can continue to survive and flourish in the midst of the everydayness, right, of the racism that we encounter. And so for us, and for me in particular, this was a pretty seminal and an important point in the development of this process.
And then the third reason is our commitment to an interracial approach. So interracial relationships of substance provide opportunities for transformation and humanizing that are not available in other contexts. So my friendship with Chris, our friendship has sort of been an example that we use to talk about the importance of this, that we have cried with each other. As Chris mentioned, I've helped him been there with him through one of the most difficult periods of his life, and he's been with me through one of the most difficult periods of my life. And these kind of relationships allow for sharing at a much deeper level. This interracial approach helps deconstruct the illusion of a chasm of difference separating us. That's why we don't like the bridge metaphor, because it's through the racial hierarchy of the United States and the racialized social structures that we have this myth of difference between us as human beings. And so an interracial approach has to be part of how we practice anti-racism. And so Chris, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think the last thing I'll say is, or I guess, yes, I said no, that's something that's classic me. You've noticed probably several pictures of Howard Thurman throughout this presentation, and for us, as probably as obvious, Howard Thurman is probably one of our sage guide throughout this work, and what he was able to do with the Church of Fellowship of All Peoples continues to influence us. And so this is a picture of him smiling, and I think there's just something to be said about the kind of joy he experienced in his work and in his lifetime, and something that we're trying to capture in the work that we do as well. So I'll turn it back over to you, Seth, as we move towards describing the roadmap.
So for those of you that have either registered to take the course or our program that follows this, or for those of you that might be interested, we're going to talk about the roadmap for our course now. And so there's four movements to our course. And the first movement of the program cultivates the contemplative capacities that are necessary for paying attention to our experience from a compassionate and non-reactive stance. And so the first step in this process is grounding. And the essence of grounding is getting some space between our sense of ourselves and who we know ourselves to be, and whatever is agitating us, whatever emotions are coming up. And so most of the time, we don't experience that space. Most of the time, we'll have an emotion and then, act out of it. And we don't think of them as separate, but we think of them as who we are. And so what we want to do is wedge some space between that impulse and that emotion and our sense of who we are, because our emotions and thoughts are not the totality of who we are. And when we wedge that space in between, then we have agency over how we want to respond to those emotions. Whatever outward actions we decide to take are coming from a place of groundedness and not reactivity filtered through the lens of that emotion. So when we're angry, we often see the world as an angry place. But when we take the time to get grounded, we can understand that anger is trying to do something else. It's not trying to get us to react chaotically. We use the Incredible Hulk as an example of kind of that reactivity being acted out in the world. And so grounding, when we're in that grounded state, we call this awareness. We have an awareness of our emotions, sort of like clouds floating by, but we notice them and then let them move on, and then notice the next one, and maybe interact with one of them in some way. And that's the foundational starting point for our process.
Yeah, so the second movement, we begin talking more deeply and more detail about critical race theory, racial formation theory, developing the right racial frame, which we talked a little bit about today, but this was obviously an introductory kind of, or beginning, I should say, kind of level. And we do that through the the level of self-compassion, right? And so recognizing that all of these theories, despite our racialization, impacts us in some way, in ways that perhaps we have not fully allowed ourselves to feel or to attend to. And so by investigating the depths of these theories in terms of how they impact us, right, beginning with ourselves, begin moving outward, we begin to tend to the emotional baggage, the spiritual baggage, and the weight, right, that these that race and racism and this racist structure has on our souls, to allow that to begin to heal within ourselves, so that we then therefore begin to have the tools to humanize and see others through the kind of hurt and suffering that they perhaps carry as well, which brings us to our third movement.
So the third movement fosters curiosity, openness, and compassion toward other people's experiences of the world as racialized. And so for this, relationships are crucial, that these authentic, deep friendships of substance. And so again, as our model is our own friendship. We've reflected a lot on it. And so when Chris shares with me his experiences about being Black and the racism that he faces, I'm exposed to a reality in a world that I don't experience. And the door to that anti-racism is opened a little more. When we share those experiences in a space of compassion, we are changed. I can't close that door. I can't go back to the way I was before and not see the racism that Chris shared with me. And so out of that friendship, then, I'm motivated to continue practicing anti-racism, because to stray from that path for me would be an offense to my friendship with Chris and to my church community. And so when we hold that in compassion, when we're grounded, we can see others' experiences as sources of wisdom and sources of fostering relationship. And so that brings us to the fourth movement.
Yeah, and so the fourth movement emphasizes engagement with our understanding, our growing awareness of race, and moves us towards what we call compassionate actions, compassionate anti-racist actions. Now there are types of action, right? So this isn't just a seminar that's like, let's help us deal with our own selves and maybe foster relationships. It actually asks us to do as James would encourage us, is to not just be hearers of the word, but also be doers, if you will, for those of you who identify as Christian. And so there are many different ways that we can talk about being or doing anti-racist compassion actions, as you see listed on the screen. Generosity, service, witness, solidarity, empowerment, justice, and accountability. I think the one that I'd like to just briefly touch upon is this notion of empowerment, because often this kind of can get wrapped up with the way we think about doing service projects or mission work. And there has to be this awareness of the ways in which sometimes these projects create a kind of tacit dependence upon those of a community we're supposed to be empowering, upon the tacit dependence on us as those who are going there to quote unquote do the work. And so real empowerment recognizes that the goal is to allow communities to be able to sustain themselves, and to give them the tools to do the work that they know they already know how to do and are equipped to do, or are capable of doing, I should say, but they just need to be further equipped to do. And so I just want to, lastly, I'll just put this slide up for a moment, and then we're going to move to Q&A. I was hoping to have about 20 minutes of conversation, and I think we still probably can do that if you guys are willing to hang on for a couple of minutes. But these are some books that we recommend, and some documentaries and some podcasts that we think are really helpful to kind of dive a little bit deeper into these topics. The Compassion Practice, The Way of Jesus, is the text we're going to be using along with the Right Racial Frame for the seminar that we're teaching. Again, I mentioned the sin of white supremacy. The Civil War as a theological crisis is also helpful to get us, for, again, many folks have a deep understanding of the role and import of race and the way in which Christianity is practiced today. And Theology's Greatest Sin by James Cone. Documentaries, you probably have seen some of these already. I want to highlight Africa's Great Civilizations because it's a PBS documentary, it's free, and often the documentaries you see talk about just about the trauma and problems that Black people have had. Africa's Great Civilizations really captures the brilliance, right, of how when Europe and other countries are going through their quote unquote dark ages, you have this, these different civilizations and these groups in the continent of Africa that were flourishing. This is some of their golden and peak years that pretty much saved a lot of the a lot of the philosophical and theological insights that Europe was able to eventually be able to use for themselves. And these podcasts, Code Switch, the 1619 Project, and the White Lies podcast are just a few we recommend in terms of to kind of get caught up with what's happening today. So I will stop screen share and thank you all for participating and for hanging in there. I know that was a lot of talking and not as many breaks as we would normally like to have. That's not the way things are normally set up in the course that we're going to do in this seminar, but we wanted to make sure we left you all with some nuggets that when you go back to your organizations, you feel a little bit more equipped and prepared for the work you are trying to do.
Dr. Carter and Dr. Schoen, thank you so much for this. Folks, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat. And just to get us started, I have one for you both. So you spoke wonderfully about compassion and also about self-compassion, about seeing all of us, including our very selves, as the beautiful people whom we are, created in God's image. And I'm wondering how this idea might be cultivated in ourselves such that we can develop that with our youth in our varied contexts for ministry. And a question that emerged in the chat window a little bit ago was how this lens might also work for folks who are not religious or who are not Christian.
Seth, do you want to say a little bit about the pluralistic portion of what we do, and then I'll talk about the youth? All right, cool. I'll let you go first.
So I do want to say up front that this presentation was specifically designed because we are talking primarily to a Christian audience, primarily to youth group leaders. And so we have focused explicitly on the theological and Christian dimensions of the work we do and how it can be understood in that context. So we're not limited to that context. Compassion and our approach to anti-racism is broader than Christianity. And so right now we're working with the UCSD School of Public Health with some anti-racism training there, which is a secular context. And so our approach is usable and definitely helpful outside of a Christian context as well. So Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's it. I think just recognizing that, you know, we did this specifically for a primarily Christian audience. And so like, yeah, I think that's the best way to say it. Like, you know, we found it to try to be most persuasive to the people who are mostly going to be here. But if you're interested in the work that we do for secular audiences, totally feel free to reach out to us. Or if you want some more tips as to how you might have these conversations or navigate this space in a more in a secular environment. With regards to how these resources and tools can be used with youth specifically, I guess two things I want to say. First is before you try to do or try to begin to have these conversations with your youth, you really need to spend time working on yourself. Like, so you kind of first got to begin with understanding your own racialization way before you start working with kids. Like you just fundamentally have to, because if you're not prepared, if you haven't done the work yourself, you're not really equipped to, I think, answer the questions that they inevitably will have. There's an amazing book called The First R. Again, it's written actually and co-authored by Joe Fegan, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the other author's name. It basically argues, and we have data to show that kids begin to understand racial difference around the age of like 2. And so they already are thinking in ways in which, and noticing how race structures access, abilities, and these kinds of things. And so it's already on their mind. And so I guess the other thing I'll say is once you feel comfortable, ready to do it, don't assume that someone's too young to have this conversation, right? Like, do not assume that. Like, you just actually just listen to what they're saying and notice how they are interacting with different groups and different people. The primary thing I would point you to is some resources that have been cultivated and crafted for young people. And probably the best one that is low cost You can even find it on Instagram because they've created Instagram that is pretty good and free because they've interested in making it accessible. It's called The Conscious Kid. And they have an Instagram site with a bunch of free stuff. They also have a paid subscription that you can get that's still pretty low cost. They have scholarships for people that are low income. And so this is a collective of parents and teachers for young children. So it's geared towards elementary through junior high. And it talks about books and resources and things of that nature to really engage these conversations with kids. I think that's the first step in terms of understanding your own racialization, equipping yourself with the particular resources, and then deciding if you want to have this conversation on a theological level or just kind of interpersonal level. Theologically, as youth leaders, I think the best way to begin this conversation is to talk about this notion of being created in the image of God and what that means, right? And to really say, well, what does it mean to be created in the image of God when you see people who are different from us? And we're finding out about what's happening in the world, and use that as a doorway to kind of help us and help young people to begin to think how other people are not viewed, even though we might say we should see them as a full image of God, but actually aren't necessarily viewed as people created in the image of God, and kind of scaffold it, I guess, based on in where that goes. I'm sorry, I know there's probably a lot more I can say, Joe, but I know we only got a few minutes left, so I probably should stop talking now.
That's awesome, though. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And folks, I see all the comments in chat where people are sharing and swapping resources. Please keep that up. We learn best by learning from one another. I have a question for both of you about pacing. So you mentioned, too, that this is really hard work. For white folks, there's anxiety related to doing the work that begins within us. And for BIPOC folks, I can only imagine truly the exhaustion that you have touched upon. I don't think most of us are patient souls, particularly, especially when it comes to matters of justice and equity. And yet this is a seismic problem, right? That requires a great deal of seed planting, often with very little to show for it. So what wisdom would you give to a youth worker who's working on this in their youth group or with young people, and who will invariably become frustrated and tired when it can sometimes feel like those seeds are taking a really long time to grow?
Yeah, don't do it alone if you can avoid it. Do it in community if possible. That's where both Chris and I draw a lot of strength from, is being in community with each other and with others on the same journey. So I think that's an important aspect. The other thing that I think when you're leading youth groups from a place of relative inexperience is so we've received this default pedagogy of sage on the stage is kind of what it's referred to, where we're the expert, pouring out our wisdom into the empty vessels of children, which is not at all accurate. And so one of the best things to do is to shift that and to position yourself as co-learners with the youth that you work with, because this is a journey that we're all on together. And so that can really help reframe things, and you can invite the youth into the learning process. And that tends to help create that sense of community, create that sense of journeying together. And the other thing is I use the compassion practice. So when I feel drained, when I feel like, oh, I'm out in the wilderness on my own and alone sometimes, is to reground myself with the compassion practice by remembering moments in my life where I felt closest to God, or where I felt the sacred was present for me, and trying to relive those moments as fully as possible. That those are moments that help restore me to my sense of who I am and help me to keep going.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say briefly is that one of the things that when we are doing our consultant work is we recognize that essentially we dehumanizing, like racist and colonial dehumanizing logics that basically have been in place for about 500 years, right? It's going to take a little while to dismantle 500 years of fundamentally doing something wrong, right? Like, and so it feels like, oh, we should just do this tomorrow. but man, it takes time to undo the logic of the way in which racist ideologies and the way colonialism has infected myself, right? It's this constant progress, right? It's in, for those of you who are Methodists, if any are Methodists here, we call this moving towards perfection. It's a very Wesleyan way of thinking. Like, we are moving, this is sanctification. It is a process that is, it is a goal. It is ever evolving and to a certain degree elusive, because white structures, once marginalized, tend to try to find ways to reassert themselves. That's what we're seeing and what we saw with the Voting Rights Act specifically. So I think patience, when you think about it from that perspective, that it's been 500 years, I think if we can do a lot of work in the next 2 or 3 years, we should be really happy with that.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. I'm noticing we literally have 30 seconds left. But I just want to take that time to thank you both very much for all that you have given us today. This is tremendous, and we are so thankful and grateful. Folks, a reminder that this is but the beginning of the conversation. And Doctors Carter and Schoen gave you all a roadmap for where we are headed. That our next time will be next Wednesday on August 5th. So if you're interested in continuing in this conversation, and for those who came a bit late to the program and haven't heard about this, this is really looking ahead to a part 2 to this lecture, a 6-week class meeting every other Wednesday from 12 to 1:30. And Megan has placed a link to register for that class in the chat. So please do click on that if you're hoping to dig a little deeper into this work. Those sessions are not one-offs. We are hopeful for a consistent commitment so as to build upon this work and to continue into deeper conversations about this that do get a little deeper into ourselves too. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please do click on that link and register for that. There is a $50 fee, but scholarships are also available. So please reach out to our office if that is something that you would like to take advantage of. And I want to thank all of you for attending this. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office. And this presentation will be sent to you all who were registered for the event. Thank you all very much. And Dr. Carter, Dr. Schoen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jill, there was a interesting comment in there about someone's